Hi, that was the nicest introduction I'll ever get in my life. Thank you. So 3 quick things before I read to you. The first thing is, if you ever want to test a friendship, edit a book in 3 weeks. It will bring out the worst in both of you. It's awful. And then at the end, you'll find you love each other anew. And you have a book. The second thing, I'm going to forget everything now because I'm up here. The second thing is I'm proud to be Miss July in Antonia's calendar. And that calendar rocks. I mean, she's like a superhero that she put that thing together. So you should take a look and you should totally buy one. And the book also. If only to send a message to Stephen that he should publish more books. The third thing is a little weird. The third thing is that there's this sort of interactive component to my piece which requires you to all be closer together. So I know nobody moves. It's like you're like the archipelago of the Rumpus, but I want you to just congeal and become the continent of the Rumpus, like a superpower, a nice superpower. So you have to be leaning against each other. Or if you're with someone and you're thinking, wait, I was waiting for them to reach out first, you can just like hold on to them. But it's a good thing to be closer, and if you're at the back, you can move up. And if you feel lonely, you can come up and sit with me. That's good. That is good. And hold on to each other because you might get uncomfortable or like your hand will get sweaty or your leg will go numb. And you can shift, but you can't let go. That's my rule. Okay, this is Fall of Strangers. You ready? Sometimes I write that she runs to the edge of the rooftop. 15 stories below, I'm running uphill on the sidewalk. She speeds up for momentum so that she'll fly past the instant when she might change her mind. The park isn't safe at this hour, so I'm under the streetlights. I feel strong, so I speed up and lengthen my stride. She vaults out past the edge and gives herself to gravity just as I'm fighting it. For a second, she's in flight. Our hearts are pounding. A few more steps and I'll catch up to her. Other times, I write it straight. In 1996, I witnessed a suicide in New York City. I abandon imaginary details. I don't think she was running, not at her age, in her state, or in those shoes, sullen mauve pumps, one of which landed askew next to her. It would be wrong to say she launched like a diver or dove like a bird of prey. For all I know, she might have been pushed. I only know for sure what I finally saw. I was working that year as a biographer's assistant at a small desk beneath a loft bed in a one-bedroom apartment. Most of the time I worked alone, interrupted by field trips to public libraries or private archives to find letters and diaries that belonged to people I had never met, most of whom were already dead. When I worked at home, days often ended at 5 o'clock, with me realizing I hadn't spoken a word to another living person all day. I was good at being alone, I thought, even though I was lonely some of the time and mildly depressed, a condition I dismissed as indigenous to New York, something I could handle. At the end of the day, every day, I got out to run. Running in Manhattan put me back among people. I'd run from our apartment on 107th Street through the neighborhoods on Amsterdam and Columbus, past the bodegas and towering apartment projects, over to the giant hill at the upper western corner of Central Park. I'd run into the park and make a double loop around the reservoir. I'd pass people on rollerblades, lovers in arms, children with nannies. Or I'd run through Riverside Park along the Hudson, over broken crack vials, and further south through the islands of flower gardens set in cobblestone. I ran by people on park benches, staring alone at the river. People with children and dogs, teenagers in tunnels. I ran in every kind of weather, from the worst heat to the heaviest snow. Running was my drug, my release, my state of grace. By the time I left my apartment that afternoon, the sun was setting, I ran down West Side Drive to 72nd Street and back again. A light rain started to fall. I saw the lights of fire trucks in front of a building. There were no police lines up, and no one seemed distressed, so I kept my path. A group of people stood looking, their eyes all pointing to something on the ground. As I passed them, I saw her, a woman in her mid-50s, curly hair, gray skirt, a single shoe on the ground near her foot, Cinderella. Her head had made a pit in the pavement, but there was no pit. The side of her skull was flattened against the ground. Her brain speckled the sidewalk all the way to the small bushes that bordered the building from which she had dropped. The same sidewalk where I suddenly realized my feet were falling. Now I was on tiptoe, horrified, leaping past what I had already disgraced. A few minutes faster and I might have blocked her, stopped her, or obstructed her fall. Maybe just one person on the street below would have been enough to change her mind. Then again, she might have struck and killed me. But I wasn't there when she fell. Should I have been? I was no one, a pedestrian, a jogger, a passerby. The cement was there to catch her. I stopped running and sat on the curb. There were footsteps behind me and then a hand on my shoulder. In a world of tragic endings, hers stayed with me. A dozen years later, after I'd moved to California and started a family, her fate was the first thing that came to mind when my friend Stephanie called and asked me to check in on Jason, a close friend of hers I'd never met. He was drunk, and she feared he was thinking about taking his own life. My husband thought it might be safer to call 911. That might have been true. I drove to Jason's house, worried I was already too late. I rang the bell, waited, knocked, and when he didn't answer, shouted into the mail slot. Finally, the door opened. Jason's eyes were red and glassy, his bleach blonde hair tousled as if he'd been sleeping. I told him who sent me and why. He smiled sadly and opened the door wide. His apartment was dark and stuffy. A small plant struggled on the kitchen table. He sat down on a couch by sliding glass doors. I sat down in a chair facing him. I remembered once sitting in a therapist's office back in New York. I was crying and crying. I couldn't handle it after all. And she leaned down to the floor and pushed a box of tissues toward me without ever lifting her ass off her chair. I never went back. I didn't come there to sit and stare at this man. I had nothing to say to him politely over a coffee table. I'd rather sit on your side, I said. I came here to make sure you're okay. I stood up and climbed over the coffee table straight to him, sat next to him, and took him in my arms. He fell into me, and I squeezed him hard. He shifted and turned to fit more closely. He sighed, "Thank you." He pulled his legs close to his body and curled up. I said, "It's okay, it's okay." He wasn't crying. He breathed heavily in big sighs. We were quiet for a while. "Your hair is wet," he said. "You smell so clean." I had rushed over quickly right after a shower. "I think I know how you feel," I told him. "I've felt exactly the way you're feeling right now." "When?" he asked. "Tell me." But I couldn't. The answer was yesterday, and I thought it would terrify him. Yesterday. I pulled the point of a razor across my skin and made a cut on the back of my left hand, on the flesh between my finger and thumb. I wasn't close to admitting what I'd been feeling in the previous weeks. I kept my life in a rush of accomplishment so the empty spaces would blur, and was now at a halt, alone, leaning against a counter in my bathroom. The pains stung, corrosive, but the color was rich and red, unmistakably healthy. The sight of it made me feel strangely robust, in spite of how I felt emotionally. Here was the blood that propelled me forward, the same blood that could tell me I was young and fertile or mortally injured. I took my time, in no rush to see it end. Then I thought of my children and husband and job and responsibilities, covered the cut with a sober Band-Aid, and left the house. A while ago, I lied. I cut myself to sort of punctuate what I was feeling. It was like this huge cavern of loneliness and despair opened up in me, and I could make it small and manageable and put a Band-Aid on it. I didn't think anyone else would understand. I know, he said, but he didn't know, didn't see that the Band-Aid was still in my hand. So I'm here and you don't have to be alone, I told him. You know, you sound like you're good at this, he said, the way you just showed up and let me hold on to you, like you know 12-step programs. Only from The Wire, I said. I love The Wire, he said. And there was Jason, this stranger in my arms, suddenly very much alive. We talked about television, about his sponsor, about differences between suburban and city life. I said it wasn't easy to walk outside and enjoy the anonymous comfort of humanity, like you can in the city when you feel alone. He agreed. But do you do this a lot? You mean show up at strangers' homes when they're sad and sit on the couch with them? He laughed. No, I don't. My friend had called more friends, people Jason knew, and in a little while they showed up and gave him more distraction, more love, held on to him when it was time for me to go home to my own family. That night he called. He sounded happy, relieved, and maybe a little in disbelief that the world had come through for him, stood in the way of a path he didn't really want to take at all. And I told him he rescued me too. Months later, I told him that it really was the day before that I'd been feeling the way he had, that it was my own vulnerability that qualified me to hold him up, to understand how he felt, to hold him like some kind of fragile scaffold.